Ahoy hoy, I am Plainwalk, and today we are going to answer a question that philosophers have been asking for millennia. What is a man?
The real question is, what is a woman?
I guess we just skipped over that question then, but to be fair, Plato did define a man, and he defined it as a featherless biped, so that's what a man is. Anyway, as you can probably tell from the title of this video and the clip that I just played, we're going to be taking a look today at Matt Walsh's documentary, What is a Woman? Now that is a question that a lot of people have been asking as of late, as an attempt at a gotcha, because apparently no one can define what a woman is. Now this is a subject that you can talk about for ages. You could talk for hours about what a woman is, as Matt Walsh proved by making the documentary. But the thing that most people want when they ask this question is a very simple, easy to understand, and rigid definition. But unfortunately, not everything will fit into simple, rigid definitions. But on top of that, sometimes a word can have multiple different definitions, and sometimes definitions can change over time. And this sometimes does lead to issues where people try to communicate, but because one person has different definitions for a thing to another person, then some things get lost in communication. And that is why defining things can be quite important, as long as everyone is open to whatever your definition is, of course. And that is where we run into issues, because it's not that a lot of people can't define a woman, it's that a lot of people don't want to define a woman, because they know that when they define a woman, well, the other side is just going to say, well, that's not what a woman is. In fact, during the course of this video, the opportunity for me to define a woman will probably come up, and as soon as I do that, people will immediately say, well, that's not what a woman is. And if you want to do that, then sure, fine, go ahead. But the thing that you're going to have to do is you're going to have to justify why your definition is valid and why mine is invalid. But before we get started, there is something that I want to say, because a lot of people do get the wrong idea. They think that either I'm indoctrinated or I'm just some crazy liberal that wants to push the trans agenda or something. You see, I want an honest conversation about these things. I don't want this to just be, oh, I'm right and everyone else who disagrees is wrong, because I can be wrong about things. So I am open to changing my mind, but to change my mind, you have to actually engage with the points that I'm making, which a lot of people seem to not do for some reason. But I'm sure that there will be people that will accuse me of not engaging with Matt Walsh's points, but I'll do my best. Also, I know that there are other creators that are also going to be making videos on this documentary, including Emma Thorne, I believe, and Jessie Gender. So make sure you go check them out if you want more than just my views on it.
I've heard people say that there are no differences between male and female. Those people are idiots.
So there are differences between male and female. In fact, there are a group of people that are painfully aware of this fact. That's trans people, right? If there was no difference between male and female, then trans people wouldn't want to take hormones in order to better align with what they identify as. But that being said, there are people that greatly exaggerate those differences. On the flip side, you do have people that say, oh yeah, there's no difference whatsoever, and they would be wrong. But those differences aren't as vast as people would always like to imagine, and not so clear-cut sometimes. If you want to learn more, I highly recommend Sex and Sensibility by Forrest Valkai. I'll make sure that I leave a link to it in the description.
And now our culture is telling us that the differences between girls and boys don't matter. That if you identify as something, then you are that thing. How do we help our kids make sense of this when they're bombarded with conflicting messages about gender and identity?
Well, you see, a lot of the differences between girls and boys don't matter because a lot of them are cultural. You know, liking different toys, wearing dresses, liking pink or blue, these are all cultural things. So there's no reason why a boy can't wear a dress. That difference doesn't matter. Now, when it comes to identity, there are a lot of things that you can identify as, that if you identify as that thing, then you are that thing. If you identify as a Christian, then you are a Christian. If you identify as a communist, then you are a communist. Now, sometimes your actions may not align with what you identify as. You say you're a communist, but you have money. How curious. But I think that's more down to people having expectations of what certain identities entail. Going back to the communist example, some people will say, well, if you have money, you can't be a communist because communism means that you can't have any money. To which a communist might say, well, I live in a capitalist society, so if I want to survive, I need to have money. Likewise, when it comes to gender identity, because you identify as a particular gender, then you are that gender, even if other people have certain expectations for you. This is because a lot of people think that sex and gender are the same thing. They think that if you are a particular sex, then that is what your gender must be, regardless of what you identify as. However, these days, that is not the case because we recognize that sex and gender are two separate things. And while some people will say that sex is completely biological and that gender is completely cultural, there are some grey areas in there. There are biological aspects to gender, of course, and when it comes to sex, well, there are some social aspects to that as well. Although those social aspects tend to be more how we categorize it. To be honest, sex is far more rigid than gender is.
Nature seems to always tell the truth, even when we don't want to hear it. But what is truth? Is there a truth?
That is a good question, Matt, and unfortunately it is something that I could ramble on about for hours. So rather than diving deep into the philosophical nature of truth, let's just say that Jordan Peterson kind of had the right idea when it came to truth. Truth is not objective facts because as humans we just simply don't have access to objective facts. Truth is what we genuinely think about the world. Yes, I know I'm deviating from what Jordan Peterson said, but Jordan Peterson isn't right about everything. This means that what is true for different people can be completely different. If I say I am a YouTuber, that is true, right? Well, somebody else might say, well, no, to be a YouTuber, you need to have 100,000 subscribers, which I do not have, at least not yet. Now, for a lot of people, what they say is true is their best interpretation of the facts that they have seen. And this is why sometimes it feels like people live in completely different realities, because some people have completely different interpretations of the facts. Some people will even go as far as to say that the facts are wrong. They'll say that the Earth is not spinning, and if they're right, well, then the facts aren't actually facts, are they? So I say that it is true that the Earth is spinning, everyone else will agree that it is true that the Earth is spinning, but a flat earther will disagree and say, well, that's wrong, and if the flat earther is right and the Earth isn't spinning, well, then the truth that everyone holds is incorrect. So whilst everyone does like truth, in reality, truth can be incorrect, and when you find an incorrect truth, it is best to, say that is incorrect, I now believe something different. This other thing is true now. And obviously there are things that are true, but their truthfulness only comes from the fact that they are defined in such a way as to make them true. If you define a cell phone as a computer, well, then it is true that a cell phone is a computer. But if you define a cell phone as not being a computer, well, then it is no longer true that a cell phone is a computer. And that particular type of truthfulness of when it comes to definitions is what I think we're going to be getting into when it comes to this documentary.
In the state of Tennessee, I'm a licensed marital and family therapist, which basically means I've been trained up to think about systems, family systems, how we were raised up, how that shapes who we are today.
So it will be interesting to hear what she has to say. She'll certainly have a better understanding of things than Matt Walsh.
So on your website, if you'll bear with me,
sure.
Quoting, you say, I use a combination of approaches in my therapeutic work, including anti-oppression, feminist, and narrative frameworks. I rely deeply on systems theory and understanding that individuals are products of and in dialogue with our surroundings, including our families, broader culture, workplaces, nature, and political climates. What does that mean?
Well, to me, that sounds like she views people as products of their environment, and that there are a lot of different aspects to your environment that shape who you are. Obviously, that is a simplification of things, but it seems that Matt Walsh wants things to be simplified rather than being complicated. But let's see what she has to say about it, because I could be wrong.
Yeah, so thinking about the modalities that I use, I'm definitely informed by feminist family therapy, and the ideas that we live in gendered worlds where there are certain imperatives that are placed on us about who we are and what we do based on how we've been gendered. From the minute I was assigned female, I was told, okay, these are the kind of clothing that you're going to wear, these are the type of play that you're going to engage in as a child, the path that maybe your life will take because of social expectation.
Okay, so that was put far better than I put it and was explained in more in depth than I went because I was just trying to cut down on words. But she is completely right about what she said. We're kind of just expected to be the gender that we're assigned at birth. Regardless of how you feel about it, you're kind of just told that you are this gender, and if you don't like that, well, you just have to deal with it, suck it up. Unless, of course, the people around you are okay with you expressing a different gender to the one that you're assigned at birth. So I'm going to skip over a large part of this interview because There's not really a lot to say about it. She's quite knowledgeable in her subject, to be honest. She basically explains that sex and gender are not the same thing, so just because you have certain sets of genitalia does not mean that you need to have a gender that corresponds to them.
The fluidity of these things, how do I know if I'm a woman? You know,
That's a great question.
I like scented candles, so how do I know?
When it's asked with a lot of curiosity, right, that's the beginning of a lot of people's gender identity development journey.
The way she phrases it makes it sound as though there is the possibility that one day Matt Walsh might discover their true self. But an interesting point is raised there, because how does anyone know which gender they are? And I think her answer kind of illustrates a point that the question of am I a man, am I a woman, is not a question that you should ask other people. It's something that you should ask yourself. Because for a lot of people, they're okay with the gender that they're assigned at birth, and they don't really ever question it, because why would you question something that you're okay with? But if you're not okay with the gender that you're assigned at birth, you might start to think, well, maybe I'm something else. And if I'm not the gender that I was assigned at birth, then what am I? And through that process, some people discover that they are transgender. There are also people that through that process discover that they're just not expressing their gender in a way that they're happy with. And so there are a whole lot of different things that you might discover about yourself. You may discover that you're trans, you may discover that just don't conform to the gender stereotypes that have been placed upon me.
If my mom who gave birth to me is a woman, and my wife is a woman, but if they're all women, and also the boy who sits down with you and says, I think I'm a girl, actually is one, then what is a woman?
Great question. I'm not a woman, so I can't really answer that.
So I think part of Matt's problem here is that he's found that there are characteristics that women do tend to share. It'd be like looking at swans and going, well, swans are white. All these swans that I see are white. So therefore, swans must be in part defined by the fact that they're white. And in that instance, it would be impossible to find a black swan, because if swans are defined by them being white, then a black swan is just ontologically impossible. But maybe when it comes to swans, we can find characteristics that most swans share that allow for black swans to exist. And maybe when it comes to women, we can find characteristics that most women share that allow for trans women to exist. So the next thing that Matt does in this documentary is he goes out and he asks people, what is a woman? And he gets some different responses. Some people find it hard to define a woman. One person associates it with being pretty and delicate, but one person has quite an interesting response, I think.
Defining womanhood is just a project of someone who identifies as a woman.
Yeah, but what do they identify? You see what I'm saying? What do they identify as? They identify as a woman, but what is that?
I honestly don't know.
So I think his answer there is similar to what I'd say. If someone were to ask me, what is a woman? My answer would be, well, it's an identity. Now, obviously, there is a flaw with that answer that a lot of people will point out, and that is just simply calling something an identity is kind of meaningless, right? Like, if your identity is a Christian, then there's more associated with that than just being a Christian. Typically, it's associated with something like a belief in the Bible, but just because you believe in the Bible doesn't mean that you're a Christian. You could be a Satanist and believe in the Bible. And you don't have to believe in the Bible to be a Christian. You could think that the Bible is complete bollocks and still go, yeah, I'm still a Christian though. There are heaps of other connotations that you can attach to being Christian that a lot of Christians will go, yeah, that describes me. But then you'll also have a lot of Christians that will say, no, that particular connotation there doesn't really describe me. Now that doesn't mean that we can't define what a Christian is all of a sudden, but it does mean that when we do define what a Christian is, we have to keep in mind that there will be some people that don't fit within that definition. And more importantly, there will be people that will fit within that definition that aren't Christians, which is why it's important to call it an identity. Now, returning to what is a woman, well, it's an identity, but what associations does that identity have? Typically, it's associated with femininity. Now, that does not mean that you have to be feminine to be a woman. It just means that typically, being a woman is associated with being feminine. You can also attach other things, like it's typically associated with female sex characteristics, but if you have female sex characteristics, that does not make you a woman because there's that identity part. And just because you don't have female sex characteristics, that doesn't necessarily exclude you from being a woman either. I think that's a pretty good definition because, yes, it is vague, but that's kind of the point. Like any definition that has to do with identity, you can't rigidly define it because ultimately identity comes down to, do you identify with it?
It's a simple question. So why is it so hard to answer?
Well, that's for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's probably because you're looking for a particular answer that you agree with. And secondly, not everyone has really thought about it. The only reason why I'm able to give a definition is because I've thought about it a lot. You know, I'll be thinking about something like, why is an optional header not optional? But at the same time, I'll be thinking about, what is a woman? And despite me having a definition, there will be people that will disagree with me.
For all of human existence, women were understood to be a certain thing. So what changed?
Well, we decided that gender and sex are different things, and we figured out that woman is more of a gendered term than a biological term, especially when you consider that the word man is definitely a gendered term and not a biological one. If you're a male, there are clearly heaps of things that you can do, but if you want to be seen as a man, well, you can't do a lot of those things. Unless, of course, you're around people that don't really care what you do, but unfortunately, there are a lot of people that do.
Dr. Marcy Bowers, first of all, thanks for talking to us.
My pleasure.
So you're a world-renowned gynecologist and surgeon. You're also a transgender woman. Can you tell me a little bit about...
Well, I mean, I identify as a woman, but...
You're a woman, right.
I'm a woman with... I mean, that's my life, day to day. But I have a transgender history.
Alright, so this is something that I know that a lot of people are probably going to find quite weird. Because when it comes to trans people, and I might be completely wrong about this, but I don't think you really stop being transgender unless you detransition. However, I kind of get where she's coming from with what she's saying. Like, if I meet someone who is a woman, and I keep on referring to her as a cisgender woman, she'd probably want me to stop referring to her like that. Because when you add that qualifier, it's like, why are you doing that? Why do you constantly feel the need to refer to them as cisgender? And I feel like that's how a lot of transgender women feel, because they keep on getting referred to as a transgender woman when they should just be referred to as a woman.
So one thing on your website, it says GAV, gender affirming vaginoplasty. What is that exactly?
Matt, do you not look up these things before you ask these questions? You can easily just Google, what is vaginoplasty? It takes 5 seconds to type it into Google, and you'll see that it's basically just giving someone a vagina through surgery.
Does anyone ever regret their surgeries? Or, well, we know they do, but how often do people regret their surgeries?
Well, actually, we don't know that they do. There are legitimate detransitioners, and there are people who truly feel that in their journey, they may have made a mistake. Now, fortunately, this is a really, really uncommon phenomenon.
She is right, it is a very uncommon phenomenon. It's also very difficult to figure out how common it is. Some people try to paint it as being very high, like 60 to 70%, and other people try to paint it as being very, very low, like 0.01%. And keep in mind that not everyone who detransitions will have gone through surgeries. Some will, and some will definitely regret it. And some will have gone through hormones. The reason why I bring this up is because the regret rate for detransitioners, as far as I can tell, is about 2%. So that's 2% of detransitioners that regret transitioning, not 2% of all trans people, just 2% of detransitioners. This is because the people that detransition for different reasons. Sometimes it's because they can't afford hormones, or sometimes it's because people are being very transphobic towards them. So yes, there are heaps of different reasons. Of course, regret is a reason and it should be taken seriously, but we shouldn't act like regret is the only reason why people detransition. So the next question that Matt asks is about transabled people, people that want to be disabled but are fully able-bodied at the current point in time. This is her response to it.
That doesn't have anything to do with gender identity.
I love that response because that is completely true. It doesn't have anything to do with gender identity. And it is one of those questions that kind of ignores the fact that people get surgeries for all kinds of different things. Body dysmorphia is a real thing. And obviously there are limits, like if someone doesn't want an arm, we're not going to amputate their arm. But if someone wants plastic surgery for their face, yeah, generally we give it to them as long as they pay for it. I personally know people that have had surgery to remove a lot of weight because they had a lot of weight and didn't like the fact that they were overweight. These things are far more analogous to gender-affirming surgery than chopping off someone's arm.
But what is a woman?
A woman is a it's a combination of your physical attributes and then what you're showing to the world and the gender clues that you give. And hopefully those match your gender identity.
Well, he's got an answer. Time to pack up and go home.
The critics on the other side of this.
Oh, of course he's not going to just leave it there, is he? Now, he doesn't actually finish what he says there because she says that there's not many critics on the other side, which I'd agree with her, even if it sometimes does sound like there are a lot of critics. But the next thing he does is he interviews someone who had a bit of an altercation, let's say, with a trans woman because he had a sign which, honestly, I think was quite transphobic.
Aberdeen Councilwoman Tiesa Meskis confronted owner Don Suker about a sign he posted in his store.
So yeah, I'd say that that sign is fairly transphobic, and there's really no reason to put that sign up.
You're saying councilman, this individual was saying, I'm a woman.
Right.
And you said you're not a woman. How do you know that that person's not a woman?
How do I know?
Yeah.
Well, common sense.
If answering the question, what is a woman, was just as easy as common sense, then this question would have been answered a long time ago. Because you see, it's just common sense that trans women are women.
Doesn't the science say that if someone identifies as a woman, then they are?
No. Now, that's completely bogus.
Okay, so there are things that the science does say about this. However, I think a lot of the question isn't so much about the science, it's about philosophy. The question of should we define women in a way that includes trans women, yeah, there is a little bit of science to it, but it's more a philosophical question. What the science says about it is that when it comes to the brain, a trans woman's brain is very similar to a cis woman's brain. And when you misgender people, often it can cause people emotional distress. So maybe we should just accept that people are the gender that they say they are.
What about their feelings?
I don't give a shit about their feelings. I'm old.
Just because you're old, it doesn't mean that you get to be a dick. I know old people that do treat transgender people with respect. Alright, so let's move on to the next interview where Matt actually asks an interesting question.
At what age can a child first begin to transition into another gender or identify themselves as a gender different from how they were born?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's research and data that show that babies and infants understand differences in gender.
Now, that is actually quite interesting. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people that view these kinds of things as, oh, it's just a choice. And they assume that because it's just a choice, that young people can't really know what gender they want to be for the rest of their lives. And because of that, I think a lot of people need to talk to trans people more often. Sure, not every trans person figured it out at a young age, but some did. Often when conversations are had about trans people sometimes aren't involved, so people just assume things about them. And rather than listening to people that are actually trans, often people try to relate it to what they might have experienced. Whereas in reality, I think that there are certain experiences that people go through that another person wouldn't even be able to begin to imagine what it must be like.
When the doctor sees the penis and says, this is a male, has the sex of male, that's an arbitrary distinction.
Telling that family, based on that little penis, that your child is absolutely 100% male identified, no matter what else occurs in their life, that's not correct.
Okay, Matt needs to really stop confusing sex and gender. They are not the same thing. You can generally tell from someone's genitals what their sex is. Sometimes their chromosomes may be a little bit different because chromosomes are weird. But knowing someone's sex, whilst it may be an indicator of their gender, does not tell you exactly what their gender is.
What's the gender affirmation process?
Affirmation means that as a pediatrician, as someone who says my job is to provide the best medical care for you, is I need to listen really carefully.
You know, the world would be a better place if there were more people that were to just, listen very carefully, especially to trans people. In fact, if you properly listen to trans people and then talk to them about it, you might even help them find out more about themselves. But that doesn't really happen if you're just constantly asking the trans person, well, what is a woman?
Have you ever met a 4-year-old who believes in Santa Claus?
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that this is someone who maybe has a tenuous grasp on reality?
They have an appropriate 4-year-old handle on the
Sure.
reality
Agreed.
that's very real for them.
Agreed. But
So that is true that children often have wacky ideas, but you also have adults that believe that the Queen is a lizard person. You have adults that believe that the Earth is flat. You have adults that believe that JFK never died. That doesn't mean that adults are all of a sudden unfit to know what their gender is. But do you want to know the interesting thing? Many kids actually do figure out that Santa Claus isn't real and that it's just their parents. Sometimes kids are smarter than what we give them credit for. Yeah, they can be pretty stupid too, but so can adults. And this is ignoring the fact that sometimes gender dysphoria is a lot more obvious than you might think. It's just not exactly easy to empathize with someone where you have no idea what their experience is like.
when I see a child who, believes in Santa Claus, and then let's say this is a boy and he says, I'm a girl.
Mm-hmm.
This is someone who can't distinguish between fantasy and reality, so how could you take that as a reality?
I would say that as a pediatrician and as a parent, I would say how wonderful my 4-year-old and their imagination is.
Okay, I'm not gonna lie, her answer was a bit weird to me, but there is something interesting about what Matt is saying here. And I think it's this idea that children are irrational, hold irrational beliefs, so therefore they don't know what they're talking about. And I think this is quite problematic because it leads to children who may have particular grievances getting ignored because they don't know what they're talking about. As a kid, whenever I got sick, I was told, it's not that bad, you don't need a cough lolly, you're just overreacting. As a kid, I knew exactly how I felt, but the way that I felt was getting ignored because I'm a hypochondriac apparently. Now imagine that, but you know exactly how you feel about your gender, but people are ignoring you because you're a kid, you don't know what gender is about. That would have to suck, being told that you're not experiencing the thing that you know that you're experiencing sucks. I know, I have gone through that. Fortunately though, I'm an adult now, so if I need something to deal with a flu, I don't need to ask my parents for permission. I feel like that analogy can also be used for a lot of other things where the way that someone feels is just kind of ignored.
If I said that I feel a certain way, then obviously you can't tell me I don't feel that way. Yeah. But just because I feel that way, does that mean that it's true?
I mean, if someone says that they are depressed all the time, then it is probably true that they have depression. Likewise, if someone says that they have gender dysphoria and say, man, I feel like a woman, then they're probably a woman. Just because someone says that they're a woman doesn't suddenly mean that they're saying, I have a vagina now and I have titties now. That's why they get hormones. That's why they get surgeries.
What if I said, I want you to say that it's true that I'm a woman? Would you say that?
Okay, you're a woman.
I would also say that.
If you want.
Yeah.
I mean, Matt, we already do that. I'm doing it right now. You say that your name is Matt. Maybe your actual name on your birth certificate is Matthew. I don't care what your actual name on your birth certificate is. I will call you Matt because that is how you like to be referred to it. Likewise, if a friend of mine says, can you please use these pronouns? You know what I do? I use those pronouns. Yeah, sometimes I'll make mistakes, but who doesn't? Likewise, if you want to be called a woman, Matt, I will call you a woman. Doesn't harm me in any way whatsoever.
What if I said that it's true? My truth is that you don't exist. Does that mean you no longer exist?
I mean, if that's your truth, sure. I don't.
Okay, I'm going to do something because what Matt is saying is honestly getting tired because Matt will constantly conflate identity with something in external reality. It'd be like if I said that Matt identifying as a Christian is trying to force me to accept that God exists, which is obviously not true. If Matt is a Christian, I don't have to accept that God exists, but I can still respect his identity as a Christian. Now, going back to what Matt said about people not being real, yes, you can believe that someone is not real. Whether you believe that they are real or not doesn't change whether they are real. Now, if you were to say, well, I don't think you're real, so I'm going to take away your rights. Now it's not just something that you yourself believe. It's something that is negatively affecting others. So now what I'm going to do is if Matt conflates trying to change reality with identity, I'm just going to skip that part.
I guess we should start with, we've got gender and sex, right?
Yeah.
What What's the difference between the two? Is there a difference?
I saw that in your questions and I thought, my goodness, this is what we spend an entire semester kind of thinking through.
In other words, it's fairly nuanced. It's easy to think of sex as something that's purely biological and gender as a social construct. But in reality, there is overlap between the two, and therefore there is a sort of grey area where you're not sure whether it's sex or gender. For example, if I were to take estrogen, I would experience changes in my body. There would be certain secondary sex characteristics that would change about me. So is that a change in sex, or is it a change in gender? I'd say that at that point, maybe you have to start dividing the categories of sex and gender into different components and work out which components are affected by that. And that is why the subject can get so complicated.
But what we tend to think about in the social sciences today is that sex refers to a set of biological characteristics and gender is a social construct or category. What I think is often misleading about that characterization is allowed to be sort of messy and complicated. But in that framing, when you split them up into these wholly discrete constructs, studies scholars, and really more specifically...
Okay, he really should have given a different answer there. Not because I disagree with what he's saying, but because it's clearly too many words for Matt Walsh. As soon as you start saying something that is over one sargon in length, then Matt Walsh just completely zones out.
So are gender and sex two different things, or...?
Well, I think that they both are and they aren't. I'm comfortable saying that gender and sex are two different constructs, but they're deeply intertwined with each other.
See, this is where I'd like to have honest discussion, because this kind of thing is deeply interesting to me, and I'd like to ask more about it. For example, which parts of gender and sex are intertwined? Should we maybe split the category of sex so that we can communicate certain ideas more clearly? That is the discussion that I'd really like to have with this guy, and it would have helped if I could actually watch the full thing that Matt recorded there, not just an edited down version to make it seem like he was talking on for hours. And maybe he was talking on for hours, who knows, but you know, maybe Matt could release the video on his YouTube channel. That would be the one Matt Walsh video that I'd enjoy watching.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really uncomfortable with that language of like getting to the truth. Again, in social life.
Why is that uncomfortable?
Because it sounds actually deeply transphobic to me.
So the reason why I think that this person doesn't like the word truth and why Matt loves it so much is because they're talking about fundamentally different things when they think about truth. When Matt thinks about truth, he is thinking about objective reality. When someone says that they're a man, to Matt, that is them saying that their body is that of a male. To the professor, it seems like when someone says that they are a man, what they are saying is that they identify with the characteristics of a man. So Matt is doing the conflation thing again.
What is a woman?
What do you think the answer to that question is?
Well, I'm asking. That's why I came to a college professor who's this is what you do.
What other kinds of answers have you gotten?
A lot of like this, where you're not answering, and I've gotten a lot of that. So
I think it's interesting that you say that some of the people you've interviewed have been reluctant to answer it, and I think that has a lot to do with the questions that preceded it and the way that you've conducted yourself in the interview.
You know, the professor really does have a point there, and I love that Matt Walsh is getting called out in his own documentary, to be honest. You see, there is a question that I ask that a lot of people refuse to answer, and that is, how did you find out that you're gay? And they look at me weird and go, why are you asking that question? How did you find out that you're a gay? And I'm like, I just want you to answer the question. Obviously, because it's such a loaded question, people are reluctant to answer that. And the same goes for what is a woman? What is a woman has become such a loaded question these days. But here's the thing, I feel like if I were to ask the question, what is a woman, to this professor, I feel like I would be able to get him to actually answer the question. And that is because I wouldn't be interrogating him, I'd actually be trying to understand what he is saying. Even if he says something that contradicts what I think. But I would genuinely like to talk to that guy because he seems like someone who I could have a very interesting conversation with. I might try figuring out a way that I can contact him. Let me know in the comments if that's something that you'd be interested in watching.
The answer you should be able to provide is what exactly is a woman?
Well, for me, it's actually a really simple answer, and that's a person who identifies as a woman.
But what are they identifying as?
As a woman.
But what is that?
As a woman.
I think that there are a lot of people that don't like this definition of a woman being someone who identifies as a woman. And as I explained earlier, I think that the reason why a lot of people don't like that definition is because it feels kind of meaningless. But from the other side, I think that there are people that don't want to ascribe anything more than identity to the word woman. Because when you do that, you do start to step into harmful gender stereotypes, which obviously is something that you don't want to do. And I think it's also partially due to the fact that for every woman out there, they have a different idea of what it means to be a woman. So ultimately, you could have a woman that thinks that being a woman is one thing, and then another woman who thinks that being a woman is a completely separate thing to what the first woman thought. Ultimately, these two women identify as women, but their idea of what a woman is two completely separate ideas. When I say that being a woman is typically associated with femininity, that is not to say that femininity is core to being a woman. That is more of a pointer in a general direction to what most people think that a woman is. It says nothing about what you have to think that a woman is, it says more about what people generally think that a woman is.
It's sort of like what you're doing right now, where a woman is a woman.
Mm-hmm. Well, because you're seeking what we would call in my field of work an essentialist definition of gender. I think it sounds like you would like me to give you a set of biological or cultural characteristics that are associated with one gender or the other.
I'm not seeking any type of definition, I'm just seeking a definition.
Yeah, and I gave you one.
I must say, I really enjoyed that particular interview, because the professor did point out that Matt was contradicting himself. I would have honestly liked to have seen more of that because I feel like that conversation could have been more informative if I could watch the entire thing. But I guess I'll have to settle for trying to get in touch with the professor myself, which I likely won't be able to do, unfortunately.
What is transgenderism from a psychiatric standpoint?
The best way to approach it is by speaking about gender dysphoria, which is an intense loathing and discomfort with one's biological sex.
So I don't disagree with her. I think that to an extent, the best way to approach it is through gender dysphoria, because gender dysphoria is the easiest thing that you can point to. And gender dysphoria can be diagnosed. But what I think that often happens is it leaves out gender euphoria. But people often don't talk about gender euphoria because it's like, are we going to diagnose people for being happy? It sounds kind of silly and weird, right? We only really want to diagnose people when they have a problem or what is perceived to be a problem. Gender euphoria isn't really a problem, but it is still a valid thing that people do experience.
It's important to distinguish those people from what's happening much more recently, which is kids that never had any discomfort or dysphoria, as it's now called, with their biological sex. And then quite suddenly, as preteens or as adolescents, they come out and they announce that they are gender fluid, or they start to question their sex.
Okay, not a big fan of how she conflates gender and sex, but I feel like I've talked about that enough already. But yes, lately you do have more and more people that identify as things like gender fluid or non-binary. Technically, gender fluid is non-binary, but that's because non-binary is kind of an umbrella term. But I think that some people can have a kind of gender dysphoria without it really being noticeable. Like, let's say that you go through puberty and certain secondary sex characteristics that you'd normally expect don't really pop up. Now, if they had have popped up, then it might be that you would experience a certain level of dysphoria from that. But because they didn't, well, you don't experience any dysphoria from it. Oh, and by the way, gender dysphoria is a spectrum, so this kind of thing is entirely possible.
So first, let's define the terms, sex and gender.
Yes, please.
Sex is biology.
Okay, maybe I should have watched ahead a bit further because I thought she didn't know the difference, maybe. Glad that she does.
Gender, on the other hand, is a perception. It's a feeling. It's a way of identifying. It's an experience. Okay, that's subjective.
It sounds like what you're saying is that if a man is male but thinks of himself as a woman, he's not actually a woman?
That's correct.
Okay, so for the most part, I agree with her, except for right at the end. I think that a lot of trans people are aware of what their sex is, and when they state something like, I am a man or I am a woman, they're not making a statement about their sex, they're making a statement about their gender. The whole idea of going on something like hormones is to make the body function more like that of the opposite sex. But anyway, I think this is a good place to end the video. Let me know if you want to see more. Maybe you want to see a part 2 to this. Now, I know that I've been making quite a few videos about trans topics recently, but that's because when people make arguments against trans people, I find those arguments to be very lacking. Like when people like Dave Rubin, Bill Maher, Matt Walsh make videos about trans people, it feels like they don't have a decent grasp on the subject. And people listen to these people. And I also feel like it's a bigger issue than it needs to be. Like, can't we just respect people? Why are we questioning whether someone's identity is valid? I think that it's far more constructive to help them understand that identity. And if you help people understand their identity, some of them may change that identity because they realize that that's not for them. And I feel like that is way better than shouting things like, "You'll never be a woman" at people. But people will say that that's just my opinion, which is why I want to hold a debate. I will make it next week. I'll have one other person on my side, and a maximum of 2 other people can join to debate us. And hopefully some minds get changed, but we will have to see. But anyway, leave a like and subscribe if you like this video. Leave a comment letting me know what you'd like me to do for future videos. As always, a big shout out to my $20 or more patrons: Hugh Jarsz, M.C.Nutkin, SHaKie, Wolfie, Morrie, Graymore Ghost, KidVicious, Sacha Campbell, Militant Agnostic, Kitten, McKitten from Kittentown, Craig D'Amelio, and Nurthen Thurmpson. If you want to support me financially, you can do so on Patreon. There should be a link there. But anyway, I will see you in the next video. Between you and me, thank you for watching.